So first of all, who am I? So my name is Mattias De Coninck. I work as a Microsoft Data Analytics Consultant at Analytics. I used to be a software engineer and now I'm a BI consultant. So that's what you will see throughout my entire session, is that I still have a lot of ideas I take from a software engineering side and I apply them towards BI consulting in Power BI. What I do at clients, most of the time I will be doing their end-to-end Power BI implementations. What I mean with end-to-end, it's I sit down with the business users. They tell me, hey, we have this data inside of this system and we want to build a report on top of it. Then I will go and talk to them and see how can I fetch the data, how can I clean the data, how can I put it in, for example, in a SQL server, can I push it to data set and then build my report on top of it. To contact me, you have my work email, my LinkedIn, and my GitHub. So for today, we have some goals in the agenda. First, I will talk about the what and why of ALM. What ALM is, we will see later. I'm going to talk about the three main options of deploying your reports and datasets. The first one is Power BI deployment pipelines. The second one is using Azure DevOps with Power BI Actions. The third one is Azure DevOps with PowerShell. And in the end, I will guide you and give you some tips on what to choose in which use case. And at the end, you can also ask some questions if you have them. So first, a big quote here. It's from Selfservice to full ALM. In the beginning, Power BI was really focusing and pushing the self-service model, but we see that more often at clients, it's a bit difficult because you get a wild growth of reports and datasets. No one knows exactly what happens when you change something. Will reports break? Will they keep on working? Which reports are connected to which dataset, and so on. So that's why we want to move to a full ALM or semi-ALM model. And what ALM is, I will explain to you now. So the what and why of ALM. ALM stands for Application Lifecycle Management, and I know it's a fancy word, but actually it just means it's a multi-tier environmental developing approach, meaning that you have multiple environments and each environment has its own use case. Let's say you have an environment for testing, etc., etc. These different environments most of the time also make use of the CI/CD principles. So the first principle is CI, continuous integration, meaning that when you create some reports and you create your data sets, you push them into hopefully on the cloud, it's easy to access, a shared repository where a lot of people can access it at the same time. It can be using Git, it can be using SharePoint. It really doesn't matter as long as you can put your PBIX files, for example, on a shared repository. When you want to do continuous deployment, you take the datasets and reports you stored on this repository and you distribute these towards the different environments. So let's talk about the data upstreet. If you are familiar with software engineering, you might already know what the DataUp stands for. We will go through it one by one. So the D in DataUp stands for the development environment. And when we're looking from a Power BI perspective, it's most of the time the entry point of our ALM journey. Meaning the development environment is the environment where the developers, of course, will push their reports and datasets. And when they are in the development environment, they will be picked up and propagated towards the other environments. It's most often also the blueprint environment. And some people might be saying, hey, a development environment being a blueprint environment, a lot of things can change. Well, it's a blueprint environment because some settings, like setting a scheduled refresh, the connections we make, etc., are copied from the development environment towards the other environments. Can I just ask a quick question for everyone to mute themselves because I hear a lot of sounds in the background? Thanks. We also have then, of course, a testing environment. That's the T in DataUp. And a testing environment is most often used to check if everything is according to standards and guidelines, and also check if the performance of the reports and datasets is fine. So let's just state if something breaks in testing, you should not push it towards the other environments. After the testing environment, we of course have the acceptance environment. Well, the acceptance environment is an environment that should mimic the production environment as much as possible, meaning it should have a similar load, so a similar amount of data. And that's really to see if your report works with this amount of data as well. And here, if you have a person who requested a change, for example, a business user wanted to add some graphs or wanted a new report, and this is the environment where you're going to check with him if everything meets their expectations. If it doesn't, you go back to development, push to testing and acceptance, and so on, work iteratively until everything is according to the expectations. Once everything is verified, of course, you're going to publish all of it in a production environment. And most of the time, this will be an environment where you build a Power BI app on top of it, just a nice visual layer. And this will be used by our end users and for the day-to-day usage. So the first option we are going to look at is the Power BI deployment pipelines. I have a picture here on the left, and some of you might already know what the deployment pipelines are. But just to give you a quick rundown, we have certain requirements for the Power BI deployment pipelines, and it's only a single requirement, but it's a bit of a heavy requirement, and that is that you should have Power BI premium capacity or premium per user. If you don't have a premium license, you're not able to use the deployment pipelines. Some extra information, you can access everything from the cloud, so just go to your browser and go to the Power BI service. All can be done there. It's a no-code approach. So for any of you who don't really like coding, let's say PowerShell for their deployments, this is a perfect option to look at. And it allows you to create a development, testing, and production environment. I will be showcasing a small demo. And in this demo, we're going to look at two different scenarios. One is we're going to use a deployment with data source rules and a second deployment with parameter rules. And what these are, I will explain in a second. So let me just go over to my browser. And in my browser, I have a workspace that's called Deployment Pipelines Dev. And here you can see that this workspace is of the type Power BI Premium per user. So it's a premium workspace. And that means that I can make use of the deployment pipelines. Let's look at what is inside of the workspace. I just have two simple reports, a parameter-based report, a default report. How do they look like? It's very simple. It's just a report that says, hey, you're connected to a development Excel file. And this we will change when we push to another workspace. I also already created an empty test environment. This is where the new resources will end up. So when I am in my development environment, I'm going to press create a pipeline. Let's call it demo pipeline. Let's paste it for the description. And now they're going to ask me, hey, the pipeline, you use the workspace, what type of workspace will this be? Well, as I said, I already called it the development pipeline, so it would be really strange if I said this is a test production environment, but that's just for the pipeline to know, hey, what environment is this? And in my case, this is a development environment. I will assign it. And now you will see that my workspace ends up in this nice pipeline view, and I can show more. Then I can see all the artifacts, so my data sets, my reports, but also my data flows and my dashboards, if I had them, will end up here. And then I can push them towards a test and a production environment. I can either let the pipeline create the environments for me, or I can assign a workspace. I already created a test workspace. So in my scenario, I will just say, hey, the deployment pipelines test workspace is my test environment. And now you will see that this icon is turning orange, and it indicates that there are certain artifacts not available in a test environment, but are available in the development environment. In my first scenario, I was going to explain to you the data source rules. For this, I will publish my default report from development to test. I will select my default report. I will also select related, and this will automatically include my dataset. And then I will deploy to my test environment. And now behind the scenes, it's copying all the information from the report and dataset towards the test environment. And once this is done, this will end up in my test workspace. So now it's done. We can see it here. Everything is deployed. Let's do a quick refresh of my dataset because on first deployment, this will be empty. And now I can go and I can go to the workspace. And here you can see that there's a test label assigned to my workspace, meaning it's used in a pipeline as a test environment. And you can see that the workspace now includes a dataset and a report. I can go ahead and look at the report. What do we see? Well, it's still pointing to my development Excel file. That's not what we want. We want the file to point towards a test Excel file. So behind the scenes, I just have a SharePoint with different Excel files, different Excel file per environment, just to mimic what you can do behind the scenes. It doesn't matter if you're using SQL servers or anything, you can change all of this via their connection strings behind the scenes. So let's go back to my pipeline. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to press this button, deployment settings. Inside the deployment settings, I will select my default report. And I'm going to say, I want to add a new rule, data source rule. Which data source do I need to replace? Well, I only have one. It's the URL towards my Excel file. And as you can see, this can also be URL, for example, towards the SQL server and so on. I will say I want to replace this with a different URL. So in the end, I have dev, and I will just state that now when I publish or deploy from my dev to my test environment, I want to point towards the test Excel file. Just a quick note, at the bottom it says the rules will only be applied. Let me zoom in. The rules will be applied when you deploy to this stage. So only when you do a deployment. So if I now go ahead and save it, these changes will not be immediately effective. For them to take effect, I will have to do a redeployment of my default dataset. So let's deploy it towards my test environment. Once they are copied, behind the scenes, it will apply this new data source rule. Let's just quickly refresh the dataset. And now when I go ahead and I open the report, if everything went well, now you can see that it's connected to a test Excel file. So that's how easy it is to change the data source rules in the deployment pipelines. Second, I also talked about parameter-based reports. So some of you might not hard-code their connection strings or anything like that in their report, and they might use parameters to make a clear distinction between what environment they're connecting to. Or they might use parameters, for example, to scope the amount of data they want to ingest. For example, on their Power BI desktop, they only want to ingest 2 months of data. Well, here you can change it to include all data, for example. But I have a report here. It's the same report, the same layout. Also just stating I want to connect to a development Excel file. And in here, I can change my parameter. For example, it's the same thing as we did last. I just change it to a test environment. When I apply my changes, I'm now connected to the test Excel file. Let me quickly revert this back towards dev. And how does this work? Well, behind the scenes, I am just concatenating this parameter, this environment parameter in my connection string. And this way I can point towards the different environments. So if I put dev test production in here, it's all going to change dynamically. Let me close this for a second. So this is my parameter-based report. This is also now the report I'm going to deploy from my development workspace to my test workspace. I'm going to select related because I also want to deploy the dataset. And I'm going to deploy it towards the test environment. I accidentally also included the default report dataset. It really doesn't matter. It's going to copy all these items towards the test environment. Of course, we will have to set up these deployment settings also for my parameter-based report. And that's very simple. I just select my parameter-based report. Instead of data source rules, I'm now going to apply a parameter rule. I'm going to add the rule and I'm going to state, hey, this environment parameter, the default value is dev. I'm going to change it towards test. Just see if we have questions. We don't have questions. So I applied this, and now I still have to do a redeployment from my dev to my test environment. So let's do a redeployment only for my parameter-based report dataset. So let's deploy this towards the test environment. Let's quickly refresh this dataset. And now when I go towards my test environment and everything is working correctly, let's go to settings. And in my settings, you will see that the parameter now is pointing towards the test environment, meaning when I go ahead and open my report, everything is working fine. It's now pointing towards my test Excel file. So that's actually the two different scenarios you can apply towards the deployments using the deployment pipelines option inside the Powershell service. But for all of you who don't have premium capacity or premium per user, you might be thinking, am I out of luck? Am I not able to deploy my Powershell reports? Well, don't worry. There are still plenty of other options that you can use to deploy your Powershell reports and datasets. And the first option we're going to look at is Azure DevOps with Power BI Actions. So what is Power BI Actions? Power BI Actions is an open source project by Mike van der Gaag. And this open source project you can download and install on top of your Azure DevOps tenant. So here you can see this is the Azure DevOps Marketplace. And here you can download this extension. And this extension will allow you to perform all these actions. For example, uploading your reports, removing a workspace, adding service principals, adding groups, rebinding reports, setting refresh schedules, and so on. So, of course, we have requirements. The first requirement, without an Azure DevOps project, you're not going to be able to do or make use of the Power BI Actions extension. You have to have at least Power BI Pro. Preferably you have a Git client. The Git client is just used to publish your changes towards the repository if you are using the Git repositories in Azure DevOps. Some information. If you use Power BI Actions, you don't need to code as well. And you can go beyond the dev, test, and production environments. As we saw in the previous deployment option, the deployment pipelines option of Microsoft, in the pipeline view, you could only see 3 different environments. When you use, let's say, this custom extension, you can create as many environments as you want. For example, if you want a sandbox environment or you want a training environment besides your dev, test, and production environments, that's something you can create in here. So let's go ahead and look at a demo. So now I'm inside my Azure DevOps tenant. And what we see here is that I have a Git repository. And inside the Git repository, I have some datasets and I have some reports. And these datasets and reports are going to be deployed towards my different workspaces. Now, how will this look like? Let me go to my service again. I already have a starting environment, my development environment. Let's say this is the environment where the developer uploaded these files to. It's a standalone report. What do I mean with standalone report? It's a report or the PBX file behind the scenes, includes both the dataset and the report. I can just open this report, and this is also just saying, hey, you're connected with the development Excel file. So now I am inside of this development environment. How do I create a test environment and publish this report towards this environment? Well, in order to do so, let's quickly go over this first pipeline. This first pipeline is a very simple pipeline. The only thing it does, it takes whatever is inside of the Git file and creates, or in the Git repository, and creates a sort of a zip file. You can imagine this. That includes the datasets and the reports. And once we have this, we can release it towards the different environments. So now I'm gonna create a new release for my Power BI Actions pipeline. I don't need to deploy to development because we already have a development environment. And let's just say I will manually trigger my deployment towards the test environment. So let's go ahead and do the deployment. And while this is running, let's go ahead and look at the pipeline. So what is actually happening? In here, we can see that we have a lot of different steps. And all of these steps are using the Power BI Actions functionality. So this extension is being used to be able to deploy towards the test environment. What can I do, for example, here? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to upload this standalone report. Where am I going to upload this to? Well, I'm going to upload this to the Power BI Actions test workspace. And I'm also saying you can overwrite the file if it exists, and you can create a workspace if it doesn't exist yet. Afterwards, because this is also using a parameter to indicate to which Excel file it's connecting behind the scenes, I'm going to update the parameter from development to test. I'm going to add a group that's just adding Azure AD group with some viewer permissions on top of the workspace. I'm going to do a data refresh. That's also something you can schedule here. Just keep in mind that this refresh counts towards, if you're using Power BI Pro license, towards your 8 refreshes that you can use via the API or via scheduled refresh for a day. Just keep that in mind. And I can also set, for example, a refresh schedule on top of my dataset. So now let's take a look and see if this has run. It has been completed. We can see that everything has gone well. And we can even see when we open and publish, it's getting the workspace and creating everything and publishing the file towards the workspace. Now, when I go to my Power BI service, let's quickly refresh it. And we will see that there's a new environment called Power BI Actions Test. And this is the workspace that has been created by the Power BI Actions extension. And this includes my report and dataset from my development workspace. And hopefully, if everything went well, we can now see that the parameter has been changed. So let's go to the settings of my dataset. Let's look at the parameter. And it's clearly saying, hey, this is the test parameter. So everything went well. The parameter has been changed. And when I go back to the workspace and look at the report, now it's saying, hey, you're connected with the test Excel file. To show you guys something else that's really cool, in my opinion, we can use the standalone report. We can change the title, for example. Let's say, let's get some beers afterwards. I can change this. For a second, I will close this. I will go to my Git client. It doesn't matter what Git client you use. Is it Visual Studio? Is it GitHub Desktop? But here you can see that a change has been applied to my standalone report. I will say I changed page title. I will include this change and I will commit this. And then I will sync the changes towards my repository. And when everything is synced, I can go back towards my Azure DevOps tenant. You will see that the pipeline is already running. Everything is already running now. Let me just quickly run this pipeline. And once this is running, everything will be propagated, and later on we will go back and see that everything ends up in a test environment and I really don't have to do anything. So that's the continuous deployment, continuous integration aspect that you can leverage when you're using Power BI Actions, or actually when you're using Azure DevOps. So let's take a look at another environment or release that we can look at. And this is a pipeline that's using complex hierarchies. And what do I mean with complex hierarchies? Well, I have this environment, and this environment you can see has a dataset connected to 3 reports. Actually, this is just a blank report created when I uploaded my PBX file for the dataset. But these 2 reports, report 1 and report 2, they are so-called thin reports, meaning they only contain the visuals and they are connected towards the dataset, only dataset, via the Power BI service connection. And when I deploy this towards the test environment. The first deployment, everything will work smoothly and work well. But what happens when I do a second deployment? Let's take a look at what happens if I try to deploy via a complex hierarchy. So these are the same options in Power BI Actions. I just leveraged what's inside of Power BI Actions to do my deployment. Let's just deploy this towards the test environment. Let's see if we have to wait for a while on the queue. I think all the pipelines should be empty. This is fine. Let's see. Power BI Actions is queuing. So first, my change of a title will be deployed, and afterwards we can go ahead. It has priority. It will now deploy towards the test environment. And we will immediately see some strange things happening in the test environment. So let's open this and take a look at the pipeline to see what's happening. So first, I upload my dataset towards this workspace. Then I upload my reports. You can use wildcards. It's very useful to upload as many reports as you want. So I only have 2 now, but I could have had 100 reports and I could have deployed them in a single step. Then I have to rebind these reports. So in this case, I'm rebinding report only 1 with dataset only. And I'm also rebinding report only 2 with the dataset only. When this is done, my deployment is done. So now it's uploading the reports, and now it's gonna go ahead and rebind my reports. Shouldn't take that long, the rebinding. It's already done for report only 1. Now it's gonna do the rebinding for report only 2. And now I can go ahead and look at my Power BI Actions test complex hierarchy. And when I refresh, you will see that I have duplicate reports. So I have a report only 1 and report only 2 connected to some sort of development workspace. But I also have these 2 here. So what's actually happening? Why is it not overwriting the already existing reports? Well, to understand this, we have to understand how a upload towards a Power BI service works. So on the left-hand side, you can see a desktop, so Power BI desktop, where the developer is creating some PBIX files. So the first file includes only a dataset. What the developer will do, he will upload the dataset towards the development workspace. Afterwards, he will create the visuals, so the thin report, and he will connect the thin report towards the dataset inside of the development workspace. Once this is done and he's happy with the applied visuals, he will deploy towards the workspace, the development workspace. And now we have a nice link between our report and our dataset. This is actually the configuration we're going to copy towards the Git environment. So all the metadata inside of the report says, hey, I'm connected to this dataset inside of my development workspace. So what happens now when I want to deploy towards a test workspace? So when I use Azure DevOps to deploy to the test workspace, we will still have the link between the report and the dataset behind the scenes, because we copy the exact state as it was pushed towards the Git. And the exact state was still the report connected to the development workspace. So that's why we have this line, and this report is still connected to dataset in the development workspace. So we can rebind this. So this is the rebinding that happened on the first try. So the first deployment will always work. When we want to do a second deployment, the deployment of the dataset will work perfectly, but the deployment of the reports, well, it sees a report with the same name, but this report is connected to a dataset in a test workspace. It's gonna do a second deployment of the report, but this report will still be connected to the development workspace. And that's why we end up with 2 reports, actually the same reports, but they are connected to different datasets. And that's, of course, not the ideal scenario. That's not what we want. Is there a solution? Yes, the solution for now is using Azure DevOps with Powershell. You can use Powershell by leveraging the Powershell modules for Power BI. What do you need? Of course, Azure DevOps. You need Power BI Pro. You need a Git client to publish your changes. Some extra information. The Power BI commandlets, they're actually just a layer on top of the Power BI API. You can also go beyond the dev, test, and production environments. So how can PowerShell fix the issue at hand? Well, to understand how everything is connected, let me just go to my reports. So I have my report only 2, for example. And what is actually happening? My report only 2. There's a neat trick you can do. You can rename this to zip. And when you rename this to zip, you can read the metadata of the PBIX file. And inside this metadata, if I zoom in for a second, you can see this connections file. And this connections file is really important. Let me just open the connections file inside the Visual Studio Code. Let me format this for you because this is clearly JSON. Okay, here we can see some extra data inside the connections file. So what is actually in the connections file? There are some details about what it's connected to, but what we can clearly see is some sort of ID that is being reused inside of the connections file. And so the report only 2 is connected to this ID. So let's go ahead for a second and see if we can find this ID somewhere in our Power BI service. In my Power BI service, I already know where to look at. We have an ID of a dataset, and the ID, it's for a second. So the ID of a dataset, it ends with 6FC09. Does this correlate to the dataset, to the ID we have here? Yes. It's also indicating that this report only 2 is connected to this dataset. So what do we have to do to fix our deployment? Well, to fix our deployment, we will have to insert the ID of the dataset we want to connect to. So now it's connected to a development dataset. What would we do when we would want to fix this? We would go ahead and take a look at, for example, let's say this complex hierarchy, and I would have wanted to go to the dataset. Let's get a second to go to the settings. And what should I do? Well, I would take the ID. I would take this ID. I would copy it. I would go to my connections file and I would change this. And if I would save this, everything would work. But of course, I don't want to do this manually. So that's where PowerShell comes into play. So how will PowerShell fix this issue for us? Well, before we do our deployment towards the test workspace, PowerShell will actually, like I said, just copy the ID of a dataset we want to connect to. In this case, it's a dataset inside of a test environment, and it will insert this ID inside of the connections file. And when this is done, when we do our deployment, then afterwards, it will know, hey, this report is connected to this dataset, so I can override it, and we get the correct, let's say, result that we want. And that's just the connection between the report and datasets. And when we do subsequential deployments, we will just override the existing report. I will give you a demo. So for the demo, I already also have some PowerShell files in here. This is just a PowerShell file that does all the things I just stated. Don't worry, you can find most of this just online on plenty of blogs if you search how to do this. But I will also include some links at the end of my presentation where you will get some extra information on how to do this. So let's go to my releases. I have my Power BI PowerShell file here. I will create a new release and I will let it deploy towards the test environment. So here you will see that it's queued and it will deploy towards the test environment. Let's just go ahead and look how it looks like. Well, it's very simple. Here it's just a PowerShell script. Now it's using my username and password. Of course, best case scenario, it's using a service principal, but I'm just giving it the source workspace and the target workspace it should deploy to. Why is this important? Well, as I stated earlier, we use the previous environment as a bit of a blueprint for the next environment. So in this case, when we provide the source workspace and a target workspace, it knows what the links are in the source workspace, and it will try to recreate the same links in the target workspace. So when everything is done, so my PowerShell deployment is done, I just did a redeployment towards the test workspace. And here you will see that this link, it's just updated. So at 10:36, it's now 10:36. We can see that everything is working fine. And we have our nice and beautiful complex hierarchy without duplicate reports. I also promised that you could use CI/CD. So for a second, let's go towards my Power BI Actions test workspace. And let's see if everything went well. And here we can see, let's get some beers afterwards. It was pushed towards my test environment. I didn't have to do anything. It was just a really easy deployment with my Git client. So now I give you some demos. You have some ideas on what to use, but I will go even further. So what options should you choose? Well, the deployment options or deployment pipelines, they are fine for simple workspace hierarchies. And the same goes for all the other types of deployments. With simple workspace hierarchies, I mean most of the time a one-to-one relation between your dataset and your report, meaning behind the scenes, you actually just uploaded a single PBIX file, and this PBIX file includes both your visuals and your dataset. Then when we look at the complex workspace hierarchy, you can use deployment pipelines. There's a bit of a caveat. Yeah, you can't go further than just the development, test, and production environment, but you can still use the deployment pipelines to do your deployments when they are a bit more complex. So meaning you have one data set connected to several reports. You can, as of the time of presenting, not use Power BI Actions for this, but as I'm also a contributor to the Power BI Actions project, I hope to include this option in the near future. For now, your best bet is using Azure DevOps with PowerShell. To go even further, do you have Power BI Pro? Well, you can't use deployment pipelines. You have to use Azure DevOps. If you want to do version control in the deployment pipelines, it's not really an option. You will have to do a copy to SharePoint behind the scenes, etc. In Azure DevOps, we saw that we published things towards a Git repository. So there we have some version control. Do we have continuous deployment? Well, in the Power BI service, not really. I have to say, Microsoft just released a new Azure DevOps extension that can be used to automatically do some deployments on the deployment pipelines, but I would not consider it continuous deployment yet. Can you copy refresh schedules? Yes, this is something that you can copy either using Power BI Actions or PowerShell. You cannot copy refresh schedules in the deployment pipelines. Can you copy data flows? Of course you can with both options. Can you extend beyond the development, testing, and production environments? No, you're actually locked in when you use deployment pipelines. You cannot go further, but with Azure DevOps, it's just a matter of creating a new step, creating a new workspace, and you can build as many workspaces as you want. Can you do incremental updates? This might be a bother for some clients. Well, incremental update, in this case, I mean Power BI or Power BI service will only update the metadata, and it will not force you to do an entire refresh of your dataset behind the scenes. Whenever you do deployment with Azure DevOps, you're going to trigger a full refresh of your dataset. That's just something to keep in mind. If you have a really large dataset, then you might have to consider using the deployment pipelines option, because there you can do incremental updates, for example, renaming a column or adding a column. This will not trigger a full refresh of your dataset. But of course, there's a bit of a caveat with Azure DevOps. You can also use Azure DevOps to do BIM file deployments. So a BIM file, it's only a descriptive, it only describes what your model looks like. It doesn't contain the data. So you could use this to do some sort of incremental update. Can you update the application of your workspace? Well, it's not possible with Azure DevOps. Therefore, again, you are locked in inside of the premium paywall, let's say, for the deployment pipelines. I have some resources. These are many links where you can see all types of manners of blogs that are referencing to the commandlets, to the REST APIs, to what is ALM, how you could use it in Power BI, etc. And these resources will help you establishing these deployment options in your own environment. So now we still have 4 minutes left. Are there any questions